Welcome, and thank you for joining the New America Fellows Program for a discussion of Eve L. Ewing's Original Sins, the Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism. I'm Sarah Beline. I'm the program manager for the New America Fellows Program, and I'm so happy to have you all with us. Before we start, just a reminder on those two housekeeping notes. If you have questions during the event, please submit them through the Q&A function, which is on your screen, and we'll get to them in the second half of the event. And next, most importantly, copies of Original Sins are available through our bookselling partner, Solid State Books, and you can find a link to buy the book on this page that you're on. Just click Purchase the Book. So I'm so pleased to welcome Eve and Julian today. Eve is a 2021 New America Fellow. She's a writer, a scholar, and a cultural organizer from Chicago. She is the award-winning author of 4 books and has written several projects for Marvel Comics. Eve's an associate professor at the University of Chicago, and her work has been published in the New York Times, The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and many, many others. Julian is a 2022 New America Fellow and is a writer and Oscar-nominated filmmaker. He's a champion powwow dancer and a student of the Salish art and history. His writing has appeared in dozens of publications, and his first documentary, Sugarcane, which is co-directed with 2023 New America Fellow Emily Cassie, was nominated for an Academy Award this year for Best Documentary. He's the author also of the forthcoming book, We Survived the Night. Thank you again for joining us. Julian and Eve, I'm so happy to see you both. Julian, I'll turn it over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Sarah. It's such a pleasure to be back with the New America community, which for me existed entirely online because of the sort of post-pandemic digital milieu economy, whatever we want to call it. So this feels kind of appropriate because Eve and I have actually, I don't think, ever met in
No,
person.
we're just
Um,
internet friends.
we're
Yeah.
just internet friends, so you guys get to be part of our internet friendship. To loosen stuff up with a little acknowledgement of the awkwardness of this, I was going to say something along the lines of this being our little chat about the achievement gap and then do a little ha ha. But anyways, it's really great to be in conversation with you, Eve. I really loved your book.
Thank you.
I've been a huge fan. We're mutual friends with Sarah Kay, which speaks both very highly of your character and the quality of your work.
Thank you.
Um,
Thank you.
and yeah, I mean, there's so many parallels between, or just not parallels. There's so many thematic and subject matter overlaps between
Yeah.
this book and the documentary that I was just on the road with for over a year and almost a year and a half, Sugarcane, which followed an investigation at one such school, was in Canada, but the sort of mission was the same as some of the schools that you write about. It was called St. Joseph's Mission, and it was actually the Indian residential school that my own family was taken away to near Williams Lake, British Columbia, Canada. We followed an investigation of that school and sort of the way that that investigation and that school impacts the lives of a few survivors and their families in essentially my community, my native community. I think one of the places that people usually start in these kinds of talks, and they could be a little bit tedious, but also sometimes very illuminative. And I was genuinely curious. Where did this project come from? Why did you feel that you wanted to and needed to write this book?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Julian, for being in conversation with me. And um, I feel like I've been living a little bit in your head because I relatively recently saw Sugarcane. And so if folks are watching this, like, please see the film. It's easily accessible. It's streaming on Nat Geo, which is available through Disney Plus. I don't get paid any money to say that. I just really want you to see the film. And
Also on Hulu. I
and
do. I
also on
I do
Hulu.
get paid to say that.
Okay, good, good, good. And I don't know if there are going to be, are there any more kind of live screenings coming up, or are you done too? I know you've been all over.
At specific like educational, like at specific venues when they request a screening, that sort of thing. But yeah, the
Okay.
theatrical run's done.
Okay,
But
so I need to
please
get in
watch the
line for
film.
the. Yeah, please
Yeah.
watch the film. And I say that partially because one of the questions I'm most often asked about my book, which is partially grounded in history and partially in the present, but I get asked, like, talk about the ways that this resonates into the present. And your film does such an amazing job of making it so clear about how that's the case, not only on a policy level or a technical level, but on a deeply emotional level, spiritual level, familial level. And it's really beautifully made. And your own love for your father and your community, and also hurt and hard things are just treated so tender is the word that I keep thinking about when I think about the film. It's very tenderly held. I'm just really happy to be in conversation with you, and I really hope people watch it. So the kind of genesis of this book is that I started um, I started being an educator basically 20 years ago at this point. And in one of the earliest classes I took for my master's in teaching, my first master's degree, I took a class on the history of education. And it was the first time that I read this quotation from Carl Schurz, who was the Secretary of the Interior. So he was overseeing Indian affairs. And one of the things he said was basically saying that he advocating for as many Native children as possible to be taken to residential schools. And one of the reasons he said was because it was cheaper, that it was less expensive to win the Indian War through the battlefield of children, their bodies, their hearts, their minds, than it was to do so with guns and soldiers on the battlefield. And it really struck me because I think that a lot of times when people think about colonial structures or like the US government, they have a way of thinking about a kind of like benign well-meaningness, right? Like, oh, they thought that they were doing something good, or, incidentally, or when people talk about the role that schools played in the genocide of indigenous peoples on Turtle Island, on our continent, right? The idea that that this was somehow incidental, when in fact this was explicit, it was spelled out, it was written out, right? It is not a reach or my own like tinfoil hat, or people imagining things to say that schools were being used intentionally as tools of genocide very explicitly. And when I read that for the first time, it really struck me. And it also struck me because as a Black person, a lot of us are raised with the idea of schooling as being primarily liberatory, and the history of, you know, um, enslaved peoples being unable to read, if you got caught reading or writing, that you could actually be killed, you could be horribly punished, and the idea that, education was a pathway to freedom. And so I became really fascinated with the idea of, how we hold these things in tension, and what it means for education to be a liberatory project, and on the other hand, for schooling to be this intentionally, explicitly, strategically oppressive project, and what it means for, two peoples whose stories and lives, and harms and triumphs and resiliences are at the basis of like the story of, this colonial project, this country. And so I really came to believe um, that you don't actually understand schooling in the US if you don't understand this history, that it's not extra or a footnote or a marginal thing, but it's actually like the main story. And so about 10 years ago, when I started teaching at a university level and teaching, classes on education policy and education history, I started off all my classes this way, by telling my students this: you don't understand schooling in this country if you don't understand this part of our history. And I could never find a good textbook. I was always pulling different things together. So eventually I decided I should try to write it, and here we are.
Well, it's a really astounding book. And, obviously for my own documentary, I had to do a lot of research and reading around, especially the Indian residential schools in Canada, but also the Native American boarding schools in the United States. And I must admit that Schur's stuff, which I had encountered some of, but never like, as full on as you get into it in Original Sin, was it's kind of astounding to
Yeah.
encounter the sort of econometric justification for a school as an alternative pathway to ethnic cleansing through warfare. And so I just I, I always am just a little bit taken aback, even with my own familial and personal knowledge and connection to all of that, by these historical documents and statements and the sort of reality of this, in Canada considered a culturally genocidal project, in the archive. And I think part of what I found also very unique and different about the approach in your book. And I think you talk a little bit about the scholarship around this, and the way that both I think African American studies and Native studies can have a sort of exceptionalism, or even books that are sort of dealing in those subjects can sometimes
Mhm.
not be in conversation with one another. And I found it to be a very fresh approach in your book, and you started sort of getting at it already in your first answer. So I was wondering, how did you why did you just decide to go about this project in that kind of a way, and how did you do that, and why do you think it's such a still to this day sort of uncommon approach to this subject matter?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I mean, one thing I want to say is that I always struggle with the language around this because there are Black Indigenous people, right? And so I don't, a lot of what I'm going to say ends up being, this group and this group. And I continually struggle with a way of engaging in that language that doesn't participate in that erasure. So I just want to say that flat out. But, I think that as you point out in academia, like many of us, like all of us, I have different identities, right? So I'm a scholar, I work at a university, and I'm also a person that's very politically engaged in my community, and I'm also a person who creates art, right? Creates writing and other types of art. And I think that it's so fascinating how in the scholarly realm, as you point out, there's a history of in Black studies really defining the world through the schema of Blackness and anti-Blackness, right? And that this is a very strict kind of bifurcated dichotomous category, and that we understand the whole world through the legacies of slavery, the afterlives of slavery, and the ideology of anti-Blackness. And then there's a equally strong tradition in Native studies of doing the same thing with settler colonialism, right? And saying that there are Indigenous people and there are settlers, and that is a dichotomous, bifurcated set of categories. They, never the twain shall meet, and we understand the entire world through that schema. So as a result, there's this history, because the economy of academia is very much like combative and is very much about sometimes fighting in the pages and getting your citations, and also because people feel very passionately about these different intellectual trajectories, that there's this history of folks kind of like kind of beefing, kind of sniping at each other in the pages of scholarship. And I don't mean to, in my own language, I don't mean to be dismissive or to act like that's not important or like those arguments are not important. But for me, living on the ground as like a political being, I feel like we are in danger, right? Like we are actually in dire straits. And it's really important to think about what the terms of collaboration, what the terms of co-understanding, what the terms of solidarity or kind of co-conspiring looks like in a situation where like our survival is on the line. And I think about this, in terms of a lot of different groups and a lot of different types of solidarities. As a Chicagoan, I grew up thinking a lot about like Black and Mexican solidarities, right? That's a big part of my politic. Thinking about Black and global Palestinian diasporic solidarities, like all these things are really important to me. And solidarity should never be easy. It should never be about saying like we're all in this boat together, and so let's erase our differences. But I often find that in all these conversations, to quote the writer Kathy Park Hong, she said, "We only know what white people have told us about each other." And so oftentimes it's like, what are the actual stakes of sitting down with someone and saying, here's where I'm coming at this, here's where you're coming at this, what are our shared political commitments? And for me, from a feminist perspective, saying, like, how is that rooted in care? And how can we commit to caring for one another? And I think that that specifically the understanding that Black and Native folks in the US have these particular histories at the outset of the settler colonial white supremacist republic. Um, our collaboration, our co-conspiring is, I think, like really dangerous and really incendiary to that republic. Like I think that there's a lot that because our histories are indicting of the lies of the United States in really specific ways. And so I feel like, and I think also part of my job as a writer is to draw connections, right? And so I think that that's why I chose to frame the book this way, partially because I think that the connections are like historically interesting and also just accurate, right? But also because I think that there's a lot that we can do together when we begin what is always going to be a series of tough conversations. And even in the time, I've been working on this book, I started working on it 5 years ago. And so even in that time, my own kind of relationships with specific people, my own kinds of political commitments have evolved and grown. So I'm really grateful for that experience. And I hope that the book can be a launching point for other people to start thinking that way.
Yeah, I mean, whenever you're engaging a question of the relationship between two, massive groups of people who themselves are aggregates of different communities and
Right.
nations and all this sort of stuff, there's so many different things to unpack, and so it's almost a little bit of an unfair question, and yet at the same time, we obviously have a sort of shared um, oppressor often in the state, in the dominant majority, which is in the history of the United States, a settler, and at the top a slave holding majority that was built on the expropriation of both indigenous land and black people and labor. And there is a very deep truth to this republic, if that's the right way to describe it anymore. um,
Yeah.
is very animated by a fear of Black and Indian rebellion, of
Yes.
uprising, and I
Yes.
think that that's very clearly a core animating force that I think your book in particular is shedding light on, and I do appreciate that it's an appreciation of both of those communal struggles. And I think on the other side of that, there's obviously for a study of education, or miseducation, as you also describe it in the subheading of the book, a sort of more basic question as well about like what is a school and what is the
Mhm.
purpose of a school. And so I just wanted you to elucidate for our audience a little bit more about how you understand schools and schooling, which of course is also such, uh, I guess maybe always a hot button political
Yeah.
issue,
Yeah, I
feels
know, but
especially
yeah.
so right now.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think so. One of the way you just put it is so succinct and so helpful that I just want to reiterate something you said, which is that, like, in many ways, so let me just rewind. There, there are lands on which we find ourselves, and the mythology that is the dominant mythology that schools and our culture puts forth is that these were empty lands, right? That there were trees and rivers and lakes, and that there was no civilization here, and that European people came here and made a country, right? That is the story that we receive. And the actual story is that there were many, many, many peoples here, right, since time immemorial, who were stewards of these lands and waters, and that in order to legitimize the project of making that country, European settlers killed those people, murdered those people, stole those lands, and also stole the free bodies, right, the free labor and the free spirits of enslaved Black people, right, who were not Black. They become Black by arriving at these shores, right? That is not a social category that fully exists in that same way. They kidnap people, they kidnap African people, bring them here, and not only steal their bodies and steal their labor, but also turn them into a new thing, turn them into property, and create a legal category whereby your children are also property forever and ever and ever, right? And so there is no United States as we know it without those two things happening, period. And as a result, what you just said so succinctly, that the fear of Black and Indigenous uprising, right? The fear that these people that outnumber their oppressors, that have righteousness on their side, are going to take back what is theirs, is in so many ways like not only an animating force, but the animating force of the political and social architecture of the United States. And so enter schools, right? So schools in this country become a place where we create and perpetuate and normalize a set of ideologies that make the dissonance of those two stories okay. right? How can it be that you pull out a piece of currency or you visit Washington, D.C., or, you go to a school and you see all these things named after Thomas Jefferson, right? A person who, on the one hand, was writing about, merciless Indian savages, was holding enslaved people, right? Was sexually assaulting enslaved people. And on the other hand, says that this is a country, founded on the ideals of freedom. How do people walk around reconciling those things being true at the same time? And the answer is that schooling from a very young age becomes a place where that is made okay. And it's made okay with a series of lies. It's made okay with the lies that these peoples are inherently less intelligent. It's made okay with the lies that these people are dangerous savages and we have to, for their own good and for everybody's good, control their bodies with as much discipline and punishment as possible. And it's made okay with the lie that our bodies and our lives are sites of legitimate capitalist extraction. So those are the kinds of like three pillars on which I base the book. Um, and schools are a really effective place to tell these stories. Number one, because they have a kind of universality in people's aspiration for them, right? That people are raised in the United States from a very young age believing this idea that, school is an engine of equality. It's part of how we make a good society. And it's also very effective because schools, by and large, are places where young people are taken. And so some of our most vulnerable people in our social world, right, are often with very little control, very little autonomy or agency of their own, subjected to these ideas. And that's a really hard and complicated thing to talk about because a lot of us have, some people have really positive relationships with schools, including me, right? And so at the same time, I think it's really important, just as we might look at other institutions that maybe have been important in our lives, like perhaps religious institutions, right? Or even family institutions, things that have helped to make us what we are and who we are, at the same time realizing that they serve this other purpose. So that's kind of the fundamental argument of the book.
Yeah, it's, in Canada, among a particular political and activist sort of oriented set of Indigenous peoples, and now I guess some of our allies as well. There's a trend of calling Indian residential schools so-called schools, in part to acknowledge, that like the sort of typical definition and cultural understanding of what a school is, maybe does not apply to this set of institutions, that included often, for example, at St. Joseph's Mission, the school that is at the core of the documentary that we made, a significant use of child labor,
Yes, and
and
here too,
was
in the US as well. Yeah.
yeah, and was a working ranch in the case of St. Joseph's Mission, that even the local ranchers that were its neighbors complained about, not because they were super concerned about the use of child labor, but because the use of child labor allowed them, unpaid child labor
Yeah,
allowed
to
them
compete.
to undercut
Yeah.
them at the market. And for this reason, there were a number of complaints lodged with the Indian agent about the practices of the school, not in the way that they related to the treatment of the children, but in the way that they related to the economy of
Yeah.
ranching
Yeah, it's
in North
like you're
America.
stealing our job. These two. Yeah, and I mean, the in the United States, there's similar, I mean, it's fascinating here. I guess maybe people didn't have those qualms. There's an example, one of the articles that I quote in the book is I found this archival newspaper article where there was a boarding school that was supposed to be built in one location, and the folks who ran an orchard lobbied for it to be located closer to the orchard so that they could have the kids work there, right? Unpaid or underpaid. And there was also Henry Pratt, who was kind of the, progenitor of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School and this whole system. He created what he called the outing system, which became really common. And so Native kids would be taken to work on farms, to do agricultural labor, to do industrial labor. Girls were taken to be domestics, right, in white households. And there were some of these households where the girls would be there Monday through Friday and then go to school on Saturday or Sunday. And to your point, what is school for those kids, right? If it is essentially an avenue for labor camps, that's a really interesting point that some people are calling them so-called schools. I mean, my take would be like that is partially what schooling is,
Yeah.
and is it antithetical to what a school is, or is it? So that's kind of an interesting thing for me to puzzle over. I think about the same thing when I think about like racial pseudoscience. Sometimes when we think about eugenics, we call that pseudoscience, and part of me is like, no, that was science at the time, and it should cause us to look at what we currently call science with equal critical perspective, right? But anyway, that's a semantic. You and I can continue to talk about that another time.
Yeah, I mean, it's semantic, but also semantics is kind of, if you're in the game of intellectualism and
Yeah,
writing,
that's it.
semantics is a big part of that game, man.
It
Like,
is.
that's part of your Euro step or whatever.
Right, right.
Um, so but another part of this that I found really engaging and interesting was you, in a number of points, talk about your own experiences as a teacher. And of course, in the warm up to all this, we were talking about how we all contain multitudes, and of course, there are multiple pieces to our identity and all that sort of stuff. But I did want to zero in on your experience as a teacher and how that also shaped this book, because you refer to it at a number of points in the text.
Yeah, I think that if it were up to my editors, this would have been much more of like a teaching
Memoir.
memoir. Yeah.
Yeah.
So maybe that book is coming. But I think that it was important for me to ground the book in my own teaching experience for a number of reasons. Number one is that I think that like sometimes when we talk about systems of oppression, right, there's a way of like making it seem too easy that there are good people and that there are bad people. And in order to be one of the good people, you check off this set of things, right? And I think that with all of our politics, this is about practice or what we call praxis, right? Like the ongoing work of asking a series of questions about what are your values, who are you accountable towards, and how are you living into those values and that accountability or not on a day-to-day basis, who are you in community with to hold you to that accountability. And so I think like being candid about my own implication, that like the ways in which I am also implicated in these systems was really important. And I also think like teaching is a really hard job. It's really, 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 really hard. It's really hard. It's so hard. And I think that sometimes for folks that have never done it, I felt like it was important for teachers that might be reading this book to understand, like, I don't want to pretend that some of these things are easy because I know that they're not. And I know what it's like to not have this sense of control. I know what it's like to be drawn into things that you don't always believe in. And so I guess I just wanted people to know that. But I think finally, like, one of the most important things that teaching taught me is just how important love is and just how important it is at the very center of everything you do. And there's a lot of everything, right? There's a lot of technocratic stuff and bureaucratic stuff and parent stuff and principal stuff and hierarchy stuff and political stuff. But I just think that showing up every day and loving young people is really, really like the whole thing. That's like the most important thing. And if you can't do that, I just don't think that you should be a teacher. And so much of how we got to this history of this incredible legitimization of violence and the ways that it continues into the present is, in my view, because we've marginalized that basic fact that like if you can't love kids, you shouldn't teach them. If you can't love Black and Native kids, you shouldn't teach them. And there's a whole world that will tell you that you should, and that there are all these other reasons that you should, right? But I just think you shouldn't. And so I feel like personally invested in that assertion, and I wanted to be candid about that.
Well, I've been told via the chat bot, not the chat bot, the chat, that it's time for you all to put your questions in. So
Put
this
them
is
in.
a little intermission. Get the questions into the thing. You get to ask questions. We get to choose which ones get asked, but you get to ask them. Okay, back to the plot of the conversation. One piece of this that I also where was I? I don't want to. Okay. So one piece of this that I felt myself as I was reading in a little bit of tension with, and I think you kind of hinted at this earlier to yourself as well. So I kind of want to ask it was on the one hand, like the history of schools for people of our background is a very terrifying history. I mean, it is. There's a lot of concern and talk about conspiracy theories today in society, and there's a lot of crazy ideas in circulation. And I think it's worth pointing out that there were a lot of crazy ideas in circulation that actually got enacted
Yes.
against Black and Native people on
That
this land.
were documented by the people who did them.
that were real world conspiracies and were
Yes.
more or less understood as such. You know,
Yes.
the
Yes.
idea was to subjugate, take the land, take the labor, to organize society in such a way that, you know, these particular people were on the bottom, and that was exacted through, you know, first sort of open violence, and then through a form of, you know, bureaucratized kind of
Mm-hmm.
oppression and violence that was both you know, like literally often physically and carcerally, you know, exacted, and then it also pedagogically, you know,
Yes.
violent. That was designed to, you know, keep us down as a culture, as cultures, as peoples. And so, on the other hand, you know, both of us are also, you know, we ended up being writers and intellectuals, and
Yeah.
and study a lot of stuff. And I myself I find myself feeling a little bit like, well, what does that say about me? That like at the
Mm-hmm.
other end of this vast educational history, you know, I am considered one of the winners, so to speak, I
Mm-hmm.
guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I was just wondering how you feel
Yeah.
in that position as someone who now, you know, is an educator whose fourth book, you know, has gone through, stands at the other end of this history. And you know, I assume that obviously all of our schooling experiences are complicated, but I assume that there was enough positive experience in your
Mm-hmm.
education that you ended up where you are. And so I was just wondering about that personal tension, because I certainly feel it a lot.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that so one of the things that I talk about a lot is the difference between schooling and education, right? And so like schooling is this very specific state institutional designated hierarchical process that um that oftentimes, you know, I would say almost always serves the agenda of the powerful, right? And in this case, and what we're talking about is like serves the agenda of like statecraft, of genocidal statecraft. Um, but education is this other like sacred thing, right? Like education is the process of teaching and learning is something that has happened in every culture with every person in every place everywhere in the world since the beginning of time. And education can be something that happens in a classroom sometimes, but it can be something that happens out on a walk. It can be something that happens alone in reflection. It can be something that happens when a child teaches you something or when an elder teaches you something. And I think that what's been really important to me is that as a lot of my, like, the things that I would consider to be successes in my life are attributable to my schooling, it's really important for me to celebrate the ways that they're actually attributable to my education. And so I think that, like, a lot of, you and I both know a lot of people that, to use your phrase, like, stand as the winners at the end of this process that are deeply miserable people, right? That are deeply unhappy people, because the material things that they've been able to accumulate moving through these institutions are always at the expense of that institution's inability to love you or care for you or center you. And I won't speak for you, speaking for myself, I feel like the way that I'm able to be here and be a person who loves myself and like is in community, is held in community and tries to hold others in community is because of those other forms of education, which have come from community. And for me, also very much from elders, from living elders, from elders past, from, you know, biological kin, from fictive kin, from political kin. And it is through them watching out for me and them caring for me and them teaching me that I'm able to be here, not only as like a schooled person, but as an educated person. And not to like flip it back on you because I didn't like ask you about this up front, but I will say, because it's in your bio, so it's fair game. But like you are a champion powwow dancer, and in Sugarcane, one of the amazing like we get to see you dance and also hear you sing in the film. And like I want to ask you, like, how did you learn to dance? And how does that change the way you think about learning? Like, how is that learning different than the learning that you had at, you know, Columbia or whatever?
Yeah. Well, you also snuck my alma mater in there, so good job for
Yeah.
that one. You know, I was actually thinking about how I would answer this question myself after I answered it, or after I asked it. And I think for me, a big part of it, yeah, in indigenous sort of ways of being and thinking, we often are in relationship to place. And for me, I'm a native person from my family primarily resides on two reses. One is called Cannon Lake and one's called Mount Currie. They're both in British Columbia, Canada. But I actually grew up in Oakland, California. My mom's a Irish Jewish New Yorker, and my dad's a native Secwepemc artist, and they met in a bar outside New York City, and they ended up in Oakland.
We made it
And
to Oakland.
yeah, and that's where I really grew up, and that's also where I ended up learning how to dance, because there's one of the oldest urban Indian community centers in the country called the Intertribal Friendship House. It's on International Boulevard in East Oakland, and they have drum and dance practice. It used to be on Thursday night when I was growing up. Apparently, they've moved it now to Wednesdays. And as a native person who came from two worlds, two different cultures, and also have this is part of the subject of the film as well as my book. My dad sort of left when I was young, and so the Intertribal Friendship House and the urban Native community in Oakland, California, and the Bay Area became a really important place for me to remain connected to and reconnect to that culture, and that's where I learned how to dance. And I also think that, growing up in a place like Oakland, and I imagine this is also true, you've hinted at it in some of your answers already about Chicago, that there was a sort of understanding of that place as having or itself being part of a vanguard of maybe sometimes resistance or sometimes an alternative or both to the dominant, racial capitalist settler colonial project of the United States through the history of the Black Panther Party, and also through the part of the origin of the native rights movement in this country, the American Indian movement in part, coming through the occupation of Alcatraz, which
Right.
happened in 1969 in San Francisco Bay, and was also, it's worth pointing out in this conversation, partially led by students at places like the University of California, Berkeley, and San Francisco State University, and who themselves were part of a conversation that was happening, in particular at San Francisco State, about what became ethnic studies, but like sort of
Right.
the sort of third world student movement in the late 60s, conversation about decolonization and what it would look like to empower all of these different groups and areas of study that were not focused on the dominant majority in the United States. And I would say that that sort of milieu and the kinds of teachers, there's obviously lots of problems in Oakland public schools, and there were certainly lots of challenges. But I think that the kind of people who I encountered through institutions that were themselves quite complicated,
Hmm.
um, and in the broader community there, uh, I think instilled me with a set of values and also a healthy amount of encouragements
Hmm.
to be the person that I, felt myself wanting to be through
Yeah.
my education. And yeah, I'd just be curious if that was, I feel a little bit of, or maybe a lot of bit of Chicago, in
Yeah.
you and your orientation and your sort of intellectual bent.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing that because like I said, I didn't give you a heads up, but I'm always interested in asking people to share their educational stories because I just think that I imagine that what it felt to be a young person in that space was probably in some ways quite different from being a young person in a classroom, right? But like, which of those things shaped you more, right? Like so, both of them in such profound ways. So thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, I think Chicago and Oakland are two of those types of places where you get a very profound political education at a young age, kind of whether, whether you felt ready for it or not. I mean, I remember, learning about the police murder of Fred Hampton at a very young age. And I think that what is powerful about that, there's a scholar named Tara Yoso who talks about the idea of community cultural wealth and the idea that communities that don't have other forms of capital, financial capital, for example, that one of the things we have is this idea of like resistance capital that we learn at a young age that certain structures are not for us and that in itself gives us a kind of power. And so I think Chicago and Oakland are both places where you learn the ways that the state is like does not have your back and actually is trying intentionally to harm you, to kill you in some cases, right? And that we can see that as being demoralizing, but we can also see that as a type of gift because, man, there's a lot of people right now, like in the last 2 months, that are coming to understand for the first time that the project of the United States might not be what they thought it was, and that some of the safeguards that they thought were in place that could protect them are not actually there to protect them. And I want them to learn those lessons. Like I want people to come on board whenever and however they come on board. But I think it's really hard to learn that at like 40 or 50 or 60, right? And I think it is a gift in a certain sense to be from a place like Chicago or Oakland, where very early on we're taught that the state does not have your back, but your community does, and that community shows up for each other in this way. And also, something that is an undertone of what you're talking about and thinking about, like the, occupation of Alcatraz, that like even that, and even the relationship between Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party and the National Black Panther Party in different chapters, that this work that you asked me about earlier of kind of figuring out where are our boundaries and borders, like that work is always happening, right? And like people who are saying, why are we doing all this intertribal stuff and having this kind of pan Indian, pan Native identity instead of just focusing on like our specific tribal context. People, like Fred Hampton, who were saying, I want to be in coalition with poor white people from Appalachia that are in Chicago, and Native folks that were moved here by the BIA, right? And Puerto Rican folks, and people that were not in favor of that. So I just think like those conversations and moving into them and not being afraid of them, is a gift of being from a place like Chicago or Oakland, and that there's a kind of groundedness that I'm really grateful for, and that absolutely shapes everything that I do. You're the first, when you do a book, everybody kind of asks you the same questions over and over, and you're sort of the first person to ask me the Chicago question, so I appreciate you for that.
Oh, yay, we like that.
Yeah.
I would make a bad joke about Columbusing the Chicago question, but we're not gonna.
No, I mean, I'm really just thinking about like, well, and honestly, as I was writing the beginning part of this book, the Columbus statue in Chicago was being torn down, and there's and that whole like, and I was in conversations with folks about how we were going to move the Cook County Board to officially replace Columbus Day with Indigenous Peoples Day, and there was a member of the board who was like, I don't want to do that because some of his ancestors were Creek freedmen, and he was like, until we're eligible for citizenship, then I don't want to do anything. And it was like, all right, so we're going to talk about like all the hundreds of tribal nations in the US. Like, it's really complicated. So yeah, anyway, your joke ended up being fruitful. Your abandoned joke ended up being fruitful.
And
But
and fun fact that I also learned from your book, which I learned well, maybe fun is maybe not the right descriptor of the fact, but facts, troubling, existent, important.
yeah,
Um, One that I learned is that actually Columbus statues are the third most prevalent statues across the United States, which I have to admit, I've wrote the Columbus statue editorial like multiple times at this point in
right.
my writing career, and that fact had evaded me somehow. So just
Well,
totally
it's
wild.
wild. It's wild. And I'm sure, that's probably outdated now. But, I think that like with all of these things, like part of how people talk about Columbus in schools is so not about Columbus or like him or him being great or people loving him or looking up to him. It is about normalizing the settler colonial project, right? It is about creating a narrative whereby he is the hero, right? And I think that, I one of the things my research team and I did this analysis of like 3,000 lesson plans of the ways that Columbus is talked about in elementary schools. And most often it's with kids in like kindergarten through third grade. And most often it's through these craft activities that have nothing to do with the substance of Columbus. And so things like, cut out a hat. And we see this with also the pilgrims, right? Like cut out a construction paper pilgrim hat, or cut out a construction paper Columbus, Nina Pinta Santa Maria. And I think we should really ask ourselves, like, who decided that that is important for really little kids to know? And what is system of thought that is being served by that, because it's not about them being able to actually recall like historic facts about Columbus. So it's about something else. Anyway, I could go on. Initially, there was like 100 pages of Columbus content in the book, and my editor's like, we can't. This is too much Columbus. But I know we have some other questions. Obviously, I could talk to you all day, Julian.
Yeah, I am now getting cued at some of the other questions. I'm gonna
Cool.
ask one that aligned with a question that I wanted to ask, because you
Great.
talk about these sort of histories of alternatives to the sort of dominant colonial capitalist racialized schooling system. And from Anonymous, we have this question.
Thanks,
When
Anonymous.
Thank you, Anonymous. Anonymous, always great questions. Well, hopefully all great questions. When imagining a new way of schooling, how do you think about our obligation to return land and sovereignty to Native nations in these same places? And then I would add on to that also, alternative histories, and like you talk about fugitive schooling, for example. I'd
Yeah.
just love for you to talk about those subjects.
Sure. So I think that like part of what I'm hearing in the question is like how when we're imagining new schools, how do we incorporate the project of thinking about land back and sovereignty in that? And I would actually flip the question and say that like I actually am deeply invested in projects of land back and thinking about sovereignty and thinking about abolition. And I believe that doing that work requires thinking differently about education, right? And sometimes through the colonial lens that we've been given, when non-native folks think about what about land back and what that means, we think about it primarily through this kind of like propertization framework of just like, parceling land and giving it back to people as a form of property, which is important, but is actually less important to me than um, the broader conversation about like what is our relationship to land, right? So not only restoring ownership through this kind of property idea, but actually restoring what it means to be living as good relatives with lands and waters, right? And I think that that includes forms of education that invite young people to do that. I've gotten to learn so much from Indigenous educators, especially. There's a lot of amazing work happening in Chicago and also in the Pacific Northwest um, around inviting young people to move outside and to have forms of education that really center their relationship to the land and to more than human relatives. And also, something I love about a lot of that work is that it's deeply intergenerational. And so, we have this really kind of artificial schism where we assign kids based on grades, right? And we have this sort of promotion and things like that. And in enslaved communities, you might have a and even now, right, you might have a young person teaching an older person how to read, right? And so I think that, anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but I think that that's how I would frame it, is not like how do we create educational systems or how do we create new versions of schools while also accounting for land restoration and land back, but actually how do we understand that the project of sovereignty, of indigenous sovereignty, of Black liberation, and of land back requires us to also think differently about teaching and learning. And what does it look like for us to practice in the same way abolition, the project of abolition is partially about like living now, talking now, engaging with each other now in the way that helps us to practice for a world without prisons, a world that is not carceral and punitive. I think similarly, what can we do now to interact with ourselves and with our community as teachers and learners in ways that promote the kinds of relationship to land that we want to have?
And I would just one thing that you said that really sort of piqued up my ears is that, schooling or education, I guess, is inherently an intergenerational
Yes.
social project. And, so often the way that we, execute policy, social policy, et cetera, is very much not thinking in sort of a generational way. And to me, there seems to be something inherently, or maybe not inherently, but there's a potential in the intergenerational reality of what it is to
Yes.
educate people, that points towards a different ethic of care, of knowledge, of sort of the importance of passing on and identifying what needs to be passed on to, who comes next, that is inherent to education in a way that, I think maybe that's part of the reason why, people are so scared about what their kids uh,
Yeah, yeah.
get taught at school. I don't know. I'm just curious what you think about all that.
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think that one of the easy things that we can do to start, relatively easy things that we can do to start unlearning some of the ways we've been taught to think about schooling is to think differently about our generational relationships. And so like what can you learn from a child this week, right? What can you teach an elder this week? What is your relationship to the elders around you? What are we doing to make sure that the knowledge and wisdom that those elders have is being held and shared with folks younger than you, right? So I think that that is like so antithetical to what happens in most schooling spaces that that's one of the easiest and most joyous ways that you can kind of start to reset that relationship for yourself.
And that brings us to a question from Becca. Becca asks, how would you approach teaching children the history of education? I am also curious if you're interested in writing a children's book of nonfiction about this.
Oh, wow, great. Okay. I was like, oh, children's book, I've done that, but children's book of nonfiction, very interesting. Well, I guess part of it is like what we mean by children. I think that I want this book to be a book that, high school students can access, and, maybe some middle school students. So there's that. But I think that with all questions of like, how do you teach this to really little kids? One of the other ways in which we have kind of like a capitalist colonial construct of schooling is this idea that knowledge is kind of atomized into these little bites, these little like units and checklists, as opposed to a more circular or cyclical relationship to knowledge, right? And so I think about, how we teach young children about their bodies, or how we teach young children about friendship, or how we teach young children about food. And the way we approach that is that, we start to have those conversations in loving and encouraging and age appropriate ways when they're really little. And then you come back and have those conversations over and over in this kind of cyclical way. And that means that, and I think that's true when we have conversations about violence and hard things in the world as well, is that sometimes people will be like, well, how am I supposed to talk to my 5-year-old about, slavery? And it's like, well, there were 5-year-olds that were enslaved, right? And so there are some people in this country that have never had the privilege of being able to decide when and how they learn certain things. Um, but you have the conversation many, many times. In loving and structured ways that are also building upon a kind of cyclical foundation. And, the things that we really care about and love in our lives, and it could be dancing, it could be our relationship to literature, it could be like family history. We come back to learning those things as adults over and over. Playing music, right? Like there are all these things that when we take them really seriously, we come back to them over and over. But one of the ways that we've created a schooling system that primarily serves, capitalist agenda is this idea that knowledge is itemized and you check it off a list. And so, yeah, I would encourage people, if you get a chance to read the book and there are things that resonate with you or things that resonate with your family story or things that resonate with your child's experience, to start by sharing that one thing, right? And then also remembering to ask them lots of questions, asking them, do you say the Pledge of Allegiance in your school? Do you have an American flag in your classroom? How do you feel about that? What do you think about it? What does your teacher say about it? But also asking them about their experiential knowledge, right? What are you learning and how do you sit and how do you feel when those things are happening? Their emotional knowledge. So yeah, I would see it as not like a unit based process, but more a cyclical process that we come back to over time. And yeah, sure, I would adapt. I would adapt this book for young readers probably. I have like 3 other books that I need to finish before I die. So at least, in the next couple of years. I mean, I'm not planning to die imminently, but I always assume that, tomorrow's never promised. So I take it one project at a time.
Yeah, well, it sounds like you might have 4 books now.
Yeah.
Uh, but just as a complete aside, because what your response sort of brought it up for me, the Venn diagram, it's so interesting to me. The Venn diagram of people who are saying, on the one hand, take the books out of the schools, and
Right.
then put the guns into the
Very
schools
strange. Very
are
strange.
almost overlapping, and yet they
Yeah.
both are about like keeping children safe in this weird way.
Yes,
And for
right.
some people, apparently the way that you keep children safe is that you take the books out and you put the guns in. I don't
Right.
know. Seems kind of crazy to me. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
but who am I? So here, another question. It- obviously a really important question for all of us. What are some books or other resources, Mita, you would recommend that might be in conversation with your books and film, or that you just love?
Yeah. Do you want to go first?
No, not really. You should. You're in the hot seat.
Okay. Well, so I think that
I'll
I
add. How about that?
okay, well, one thing is that I do think that this book and Sugarcane, your film, are very much in conversation,
Very true.
and ways that I feel really grateful for. And so I would encourage people to, I don't have a suggested like order. I think you could do them in either order, but I really encourage that. Another book that just related to what you just said, Julian, about like safety, is Erica Miners, Erica with a Cerica, last name Miners, Meiners, writes a lot about innocence and the ways that ideas about which children are seen as innocent and which children are not seen as innocent shapes a lot of schooling policy. So I would encourage folks to read about that and think about the ways that innocence is something that is like kind of presumed to be a quality of white children and that other kids are kind of presumed to be criminal. So Erica Miners, her work relates a lot to that. What else? There's book has like over 900 citations, so there are a lot of things.
Read the bibliography. No, just kidding.
Yeah, no, really. I mean, do read the bibliography. I guess just throw in one more. Sarah Haley's work, Haley, has done a lot to think about. Oftentimes when people think about slavery, we just think about adults. And the creation of a category of Black children as not being children is so much a part of the history of slavery that it's really important for people to think about. And I guess maybe last one, someone who's done a lot for my thinking is Joanne Barker's book Red Scare, which is about the ways that the concept of terrorism and the concept of being a terrorist and the concept of being a state threat really comes from anti-indigeneity, and that the thing we talked about earlier, Julian, that you put so succinctly is like the fear of Native violence. And obviously Nick Estes's work, ESTES, is also very much about this. And I think that that's important right now because I think that there are ways that like even as people, I saw some tweet or something along these lines the other day, like someone was saying like this is terrorism or call it what it is, terrorism. And I think that in the same way I'm suggesting, what you said about like the semantics is really important. In the same way I'm suggesting like the way we've learned, like when you say this isn't America, it's important to be like, no, it actually kind of is, right? And I think the same way the thing about schools is it like these aren't schools, like, well, maybe they are. I think sometimes when we're trying to take a critical lens on white supremacist violence, that we still appeal to the logics of the state to do that. And so saying something like, call it what it is, terrorism, or call it what it is, a hate crime, is still kind of reifying and giving power to these categories that from their outset were actually really harmful and kind of created to hurt our peoples. And so, anyway, Joanne Parker's book is a great way to start thinking about that. So those are a few that I would rec.
I'll throw on a few. They're a little bit more on this sort of, I don't know if pop culture is the right way to put it, but they're more like films and novels and stuff. Indian Horse, both the novel and the film, by Richard Wagamese, the novel. Intense but important film about Indian residential schools. The sort of OG on the subject that I watched when I was a kid and that my mom and sort of community impressed upon me was part of our history, even though it was somewhere else. Is a film called Rabbit Proof Fence about the stolen generation of First Nations people in Australia. Um, I think we kind of have to mention a really important book and now film, Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, great novel. And then the film is by Ramel Ross, who is an amazing, amazing filmmaker was nominated for an Academy Award for a documentary a number of years back, for Hale County this evening, and then was nominated for a couple Academy Awards this year for Nickel
Yeah, for
Boyd.
Best Picture and yeah.
Yeah, Best Picture and Adapted Screenplay, I believe. So highly recommend those two. And I think that we are approaching the ending here. So this will be, unfortunately, our last question. I'm told that this one is a good question to end on by
Okay, good.
our moderator editors. From Anonymous, thank you, Anonymous. Shout out to Anonymous. What words of hope or encouragement would you give to a burnt out teacher?
Oh, I was ready until you got to the end, the burnt out teacher part. Oh man.
Maybe in general. Let's go
Yeah,
in general, and then if you have specific thoughts for the burnt out teacher.
sure. So I'll do it in reverse. So the for the burnt out teacher, I know that when you show up at work, there are 10,000 things, and many of those things follow you home, and it's really easy to see all the things that you feel like you're not doing enough, or you're not doing right, or you want to do, and awful people are stopping you. And I would just remind you that every single time you have an interaction with a child and treat them with love, care, respect, celebration, joy, and recognizing them as the brilliant force in the universe that they are, that counts. Like that matters. That counts for a lot. And years later, when I'm walking down the street and I hear like Miss Ewing, Miss E, right, and I already know who it is, my grown up students, the things that they remember and the things that made them feel seen and loved and celebrated that have stuck with them years later are those little moments that maybe don't even mean everything to you, right? But that count in their hearts and their spirits. So just know that that really matters, and if you can keep that at the center, the other things will come or they won't. But that matters a lot. For everybody else, I think that I really have been encouraging everyone to think about the work that all of us can do as educators, and I say that because as Julian and I have talked about in this conversation, a lot of what has brought us to this hurtful place is sequestering off the work of schooling to be the thing that these state employees do over here. And I think that all of us have something to teach, all of us have something to learn, and that's also part of how we build robust and strong communities, and build the kinds of political relationships that are going to help us survive in these times. And so if you know how to dance, teach somebody to dance. If you know how to write a poem, teach somebody to write a poem. If you know about the plants that grow around the place where you live, teach somebody the names of those plants and how they're used and what to do with them. And if you know the history of the lands where you live, then teach that to somebody. And if you don't, learn it. I think that doing that work collectively is part of how we live out the kind of educational vision that is going to serve our kids into the future and serve us into the future. But it's also how we get stronger and also how we practice loving each other. So that's what I want everybody to do to make the teacher's life a little bit easier.
Well, Eve, it has been such an honor to be in conversation with you. This was
Thank
a lot of
you.
fun. We pushed right up against their time limits on everything. I think we could have gone for twice or three times as long. But thank you again. I don't know how you do it all. I just want to say you are incredibly your range of production and intellect and skills is truly astounding.
Thanks,
The book, of
Julian.
course, is Original Sins: The Miseducation of Black and Native Children and the Construction of American Racism. I highly recommend it. Please go buy it if you haven't already. That really matters for us people who do this for a living. And please share it with folks.
And are pre-orders live for your book?
Yeah. Oh, and you can
Pre-orders are live.
survive the night wherever pre-orders are pre-ordered.
Yes, do that and watch Sugarcane. And thank you
October
so much.
21st.
October 21st, it's coming out. Pre-order it now. Thank you, Julian. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, New America.
Bye.